Let us hear the Lord.
Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long.
This is the word of the Lord. As we continue right in our study of creation, using Psalm 23 as our guide, last week we talked about the Lord being a shepherd and all that that entails. Today, I just want to look at the earliest point, and you can put that image up there. Look at the simple phrase, He makes me lie down in green pastures. What can we learn about God through creation in green pastures? Shepherding, like I said, is a popular occupation, not anymore today, but in Israel's history, many were shepherds, and it was considered a lower occupation by the world standards, but in Israel, they always held shepherds in high esteem. Shepherding is hard work. Many times the grass does not look quite this green. In fact, if we go to the next slide, this is Sartaba. It's a hill. It's an old Maccabean fortress. But there, this is the desert. The word in Hebrew is midbar. Midbar, and we'll talk more about that word. It doesn't always mean desert, but anytime the word midbar is used, in the Bible, they always translate it into English as either desert or wilderness. But this is pasture land, right? And that's not usually something that we think of as pasture land. You know, as we drove throughout the countryside this week and we could see farms happening, this wasn't the kind of pasture land that we saw animals grazing at. You see, for many months in Israel, it's dry, and this is what pastures look like. So if you're a shepherd, and you can go to the next slide, right? If you're a shepherd, you will be taking your sheep through the wilderness, and the shepherd's responsibility is to find food for the sheep. Now, that's easier said than done in a land that looks like this, right? And from that, we get the biblical image, right, that Jesus uses in the Lord's Prayer of give us today our daily bread. Right? That's what the shepherd ultimately is supposed to do. At a bare minimum, the shepherd is supposed to provide the sheep what those sheep need to survive, food and water for the day. And anything beyond that is just extra. But this is the image of Jesus as shepherd when he prays, give us today our daily bread. It's similar to the Exodus story where Israel would wake up in the morning and they would determine whether or not they could eat by whether or not God showed up and provided manna. And in that environment, the Israelites had to learn to trust in God. Last week we talked about how certain biblical passages actually forbid Israel to cultivate land because they were nervous, the biblical writers were nervous that it would produce some sort of complacency in the life of a believer. That if food is just going to go through its cycles and grow in its season, then how can we learn to trust the shepherd? But in this image, we see the shepherd walking among the sheep, looking for a place to settle the sheep down to eat for a day. So sometimes this idea of he lies me down in green pastures means that Jesus gives, or God gives us just enough to be able to handle the day that we're experiencing. Sometimes I think as a Christian, and there are certain Christian pastors out there who would have us believe that if we believe in God, He will surround us with lots of stuff. And if we trust in God, that somehow God will bless us financially. And if we live for God and we're obedient to Christ, then the problems of this world, the financial struggles, the relationship struggles, all the other struggles that we experience will just fade away. I don't agree with that theology. Because sometimes God gives us just enough. And I know there are people in this congregation today who find themselves here, who find themselves following a shepherd, and they know where lunch is coming from, they know where dinner is coming from, but they don't know necessarily where next week's food is coming from. There are some in this congregation whose relationships are going to survive today, but you're nervous about where they're going to be a month from now. And the message to you from Psalm 23 is to trust the shepherd. For while there is no doubt you would like to look around and see lush green meadows forever, that you knew that the marriage was going to be there a year from now, that you knew your children were going to walk in the ways of God 3 years from now, if you knew that financially you were going to be stable, that's what we want. But God says there are times when you need to trust that today's food is enough for today. That, in some ways, is making me lie down in green pastures. Let's see the next slide. There are times, though, this is the same mountain, that in the spring rains that we will begin to see on the northern and western slopes of these hills, green starts to form, right? And you can you see in that picture the paths there? Those are goat and sheep paths that lead to that green area. Now, that's not a buffet, the kind of which that we would like. I mean, that's not like Pizza Ranch where you leave bloated and full and hating life for the next time you go to Pizza Ranch. But it's enough. It's enough to live there. It's enough to look around. It's enough to give some comfort that in the midst of a chaotic world, there's going to be food for a little while. And this sometimes is as green as this mountain will get. If it's not a rainy winter, or if it's an incredibly hot summer, sometimes this is as good as it gets. The next slide, the picture's not as great. That's the same mountain, Sardiba, after a spring rain. Right? And you can see the fields, the mountains begin to green up. For, like I said, when Jesus, or when God uses the word midbar in the Bible, it means wilderness. Now, up north in Galilee, the midbar will get 16 inches of rain a year. And down in the south, almost none. So the same word is used in the New Testament, the Greek version, the Greek equivalent of that word is used in the New Testament that would say Jesus would go into the wilderness to pray. It doesn't mean that he went off to some far desert. It just meant that he went to an uncultivated area. But sometimes the shepherds, and if we look at the next slide, sometimes we see these are sheep at Sardiba. Sometimes those shepherds can bring a sheep to a place and they can sit there for a while and they don't need to move. And if they're fortunate, there's water close by. And somehow this is a shepherd's dream. Now, I just was camping with my family. This was our first camping experience. I'm not sure if it's going to be our last camping experience or not. But I remember sometimes when we camp and I'm around all my children, all of a sudden the food comes out. And I remember a specific time where we brought some like cheesy salsa with us. And it was like vultures on that cheesy salsa. When we were in Denver, in Colorado, hiking with the youth group, When the meals would come out, you could see everybody eyeing the food to make sure they were all going to get theirs. Right? Parents, if you have children, right? I mean, this is a common sight, isn't it? Where if you throw out 5 suckers for 5 children, there's a quick clamor of, there's enough for everybody, but who's going to get what color? Well, all these sort of things just happen. That's how sheep act when they get to a pasture like this. I mean, can you imagine living most of your life as a sheep, going through that desert, looking for hunting out those little tufts of burnt, dried out grass that stick out from the ground, and suddenly the shepherd brings you here. I mean, you go nuts. You start eating and you're running around, and you'll see the sheep just scatter and look for food, and they don't know what to do themselves, and they eat themselves full. But that's not the image, right, that Psalm 23 gives us here. It's not, I'm going to lead you to a land of plenty. I'm not going to lead you to green pastures, and you can go nuts and you can hoard. But it's, you'll be content enough to lie down. You see, the ultimate image of content is to see a sheep who has food available who lays down. Because that sheep understands that the food is not going anywhere. And so there are some of you who find yourselves here. You find yourselves in this type of green pasture, that the money is there, the relationship is good, and things are content. And you know what? There are times even when we can start to feel guilty about those things. When we can start to feel guilty about what we have compared to what others don't. And there, of course, we are called to be good stewards of what we have, and we are called to give, and we are called to make sacrifices in our lives for the sake of others. But understand that this is the model of what God hopes for us. That whether or not we find ourselves on that desert path, whether we find ourselves in that medium area where a spring rain has just come through, or whether we find ourselves at the end of a rainy winter where there is plenty for everything, are we content enough to lie down? Because that's the image God gives us, right? I mean, in Psalm 65, verses 12 through 14, it says, "You crown the year with your bounty, and your carts overflow with abundance. The grasslands of the wilderness overflow. The hills are clothed with gladness. The meadows are covered with flocks, and the valleys are mantled with grain. They shout for joy and sing." This is the psalmist's ideal of what life can be like, where there is enough for everyone and people are content. Similarly, when Israel was taken into the desert and then brought back to Israel from Babylon, Isaiah 35 says, "The desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God." The image of Israel returning from slavery in Babylon back to Israel is a desert in bloom. But the idea here is contentment. If God is our shepherd, are we content? Are we content in those times when we have green grass fields around us? Are we content in those times when we have just enough for the week? And are we content in those times when there's only enough for today? Because we need to be sheep who are content and who trust the shepherd, not our surroundings. For whether the grass looks like this or whether the grass looks like the desert, do we trust the shepherd to give us what we need? The word midbar in Hebrew, right? It says, midbar, in Hebrew, there are no vowels, right? They're just little dots now, but even in the ancient world, there are no vowels at all, only consonants. And the word for midbar, if you take the M off, the consonants are D, V, and R. We can remember that because most of you DVR stuff, right? D, V, and R. Midbar, right? And V and B are the same letters in Hebrew. So midbar, D, V, and R. Another word where sheep settle is meadow, and that's devor. Devor, D, V, and R. Right? So in Hebrew, there'd be no difference between meadow and wilderness. Right? When you're reading it, because they're the same letters. And it's only when you insert the vowels when you talk that there becomes a difference. But the devor, the meadow, is also a place where sheep will settle. So sometimes we find ourselves settling in the desert, in the midbar, and sometimes we find ourselves settling in the devor, the meadow. And whether or not the grass is green in the devor or brown in the midbar, are we content to settle in God? But listen to these words from Jeremiah. I will surely gather all of you. I will surely bring you together, the remnant of Israel. I will bring them together like sheep in a pen, like flock in its pasture. The place will throng with people. God is envisioning a time when Israel will return. Jeremiah is talking about a time when Israel will return from the desert, and he refers to them as sheep in a pen, and there will be throngs of people. Where is that going to be? In Jerusalem, of course, but more than Jerusalem, in the temple of God. And in the temple of God, there is a special room where God himself exists, and that is the Holy of Holies. And in Hebrew, it's Devir. D, V, and R. From the desert to the meadow, we find contentment only when we rest and live where God is. So desert to meadow to Holy of Holies all use only the same letters. And I think the writer of Jeremiah there is using a play on words that Israel, you worshiped other gods, and because of that you were taken into captivity. Israel, you didn't take care of the poor, and because of that you were taken into captivity. And now I call you back. And I call you back to rest in my Holy of Holies, in my presence, in my Devir. Because when you rest in my Devir, then it doesn't matter whether it's the green Devor or the brown Midbar. You are content. So we as sheep, are we content? And if we are content, does our contentment come from the grass that is around us, or does our contentment come from a trust in the shepherd? The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.